Hello and welcome you to the afternoon's roundtable talk. We agreed in the following schedule with Livia and the participants. First, we shall hear 3 welcome speeches, greetings, very briefly from the mayor of the district, Erzsébetváros, then Katarina Szécsi-Osbrink from the Swedish embassy, who will participate in the roundtable talk as well. And then Gabor Egri, who is in Vienna, as far as I know, at the present. So we have him digitally with us. So we shall share his thoughts. And then we're going to listen to MÁTÉ ZOMBORY with his lecture. And then we shall have a 5-minute break for cafe drinks, etc. And then we follow up with the roundtable talk. So I would like to ask Peter Niedermüller first. So thank you very much for
Thank you very much, my dear friends, young friends, ladies and gentlemen. This is really my pleasure and honor to be here this afternoon. As I have heard, you made a short walk in the district, so you have seen different parts of the district, and I have to say that I am really proud to be mayor of this district because it's a wonderful place, as probably you have seen it. I don't know if you have a broader knowledge about the district, but don't worry, I'm not going to talk about the whole history of the district. But one thing is very important, or maybe 2. The first is that Erzsébettown, this is the name of this district, this is the traditional home of Jewish population since the early 19th century. And this is a long and many times really tragical history, which of course a very important bridge between Jewish people living in this district and non-Jewish people living in this district. I have heard that you are working on the memory of Holocaust and on the politics of memory, and I have to say to you that this is one of the most important topics in today's Hungary. How to handle with memory and how to use memory for political purposes. And what is actually social memory. So I'm not going to give you a very theoretical lecture, but I think so that this is a very important issue for all of us to think about the past, about the tradition, about the heritage, and about the historical events happened in this district. You know probably that maybe 300 meters from here, this is the Klausthal Square, and it was in the terrible winter of 1944-45, it was the center of the Jewish ghetto in Budapest, and many other memorable places in this district. The other thing I would like to mention to you, Erzsébettown is not only a Jewish district, this is very much a multicultural district as well. We have many different ethnic groups, religions, cultures in this district, and I think so this is one of the most beautiful parts of this district, that we have so many different cultures, religions, and people. I am sure that you will have a very interesting and exciting debate. I have to say, I know MÁTÉ for a long time, and I know that his ideas are always very interesting and important, and sometimes very controversial, maybe, but this is very important for a debate to have controversial ideas. Unfortunately, I won't be able to stay for the whole time, but I wish you a very exciting evening, and I am really glad that you visited this district. Thank you very much.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Katarina Szécsi-Osbrink, and from my name, or my 2 names, which are absolutely unpronounceable, unless you write them in Russian, so I learned in Moscow, I'm a Hungarian-Swedish cocktail. I'm also the Deputy Chief of Mission of the Swedish Embassy here in Budapest on my 5th year. And I'm so happy to be here today, and I want to thank the Institute, I want to thank the Mayor for also participating here today, because actually I think one of the most rewarding parts of my work as a diplomat is to be out there and to meet people like you, the future of Europe, because that's what you are, and to have discussions, to have controversies. I love controversies. I also look so much forward to MÁTÉ's lecture. I hope to be able to perhaps contribute with something, because we have a very important person in our embassy who's actually somebody who's present in my mind on a daily basis. And that's my former colleague, Raoul Wallenberg, the Swedish diplomat, who did tremendous deeds here in Budapest during the war, so very, very much in this district. And exactly as Mr. Mayor was saying, this district is very special. I would call it the heart of Budapest. And I'm not completely objective here, because I also have a personal story. Because my family, actually my father, he lived here not far away. He lived here together with my grandmother, who also survived here. And that's kind of a cliffhanger where I get back to. So this is a very personal story for here, and actually connecting to a lot of the issues that Mr. Mayor was mentioning. Looking forward to the panel. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Gábor Egri, the director of the Institute of Political History, the organizer of this event. I warmly welcome everyone, our guests from the participants of the EU United We Stand project from France, Bulgaria, Germany, and Poland, our hosts here in the Chinese Street, the City Council of the 7th District of Budapest, and the invited speakers, MÁTÉ ZOMBORY, Ágnes Kelemen, and Katarina Szécsi Ósbrink, the deputy head of the Swedish Embassy in Budapest. The EU United We Stand project is a cooperative project about issues of historical memory in Europe and the change of regime. This is the first event, and as we, or more precisely, you are in Budapest, it is practically natural to dedicate this event to the memory of the Jewish life and especially the Holocaust. Why? Because Budapest is one of those unique Eastern European cities where a large Jewish community, after much torture, but survived the Holocaust. Thus, this is not just a Skansen, not just an open museum where you are, but something that is still connected to living memory and a history that is palpable and continuous until today. Why the Holocaust is an important issue for European memory, the topic of this common project. As you will hear from the speakers, it was a very important element of how, after the change of regime, European memory was attempted to be constructed. It was also a kind of liberating experience to deal with the memory of an event, a momentous historical event that was suppressed for a long time or was allowed to be approached only certain ways. So after 1918, it was also a symbol of the newly acquired freedom and liberty, that people started to speak much more about the Holocaust, not just historians, but also artists and common people who just had the opportunity to share their memories. Nevertheless, and this is why we think it is important to think about what happened with the memory of the Holocaust in the last 30 years, as you will hear from MÁTÉ ZOMBORY, there are certain complicated issues with how the memory of the Holocaust was instrumentalized for the purpose of building a European community. I hope that the other invited speaker will somehow contradict a bit MÁTÉ, whose cool scientific analysis could be, for some of you, not just sobering, but probably discouraging. And I also hope, or I'm sure, that the message of this event is not just that we should always rethink what we think being granted regarding historical events, regarding how we treat historical events, but also that whatever failures political actors and also social actors committed regarding the memory of the Holocaust, and how they, even though they didn't want it to do it, encourage certain trends that are not as welcome as we would like. It is still something that the Holocaust conveys to posterity, to us, and this is the necessity of humanity, the necessity of being a human being. We all know that is sometimes hard to do, and we all know that not all of us are capable in the face of hardships, political suppression, or even violence. But, and this is important, the Holocaust also demonstrates that there are always people who do it, and we, who are probably weaker than those people, can still take encouragement for our actions in dire circumstances. So, thank you very much, and have a nice evening.
So perhaps this is the correct time to call Mr. MÁTÉ ZOMBORY from the Institute for Sociology of the Center for Social Sciences. A few years ago I would have added the Hungarian Science Academy, but now we all imagine those three letters there in front of. So MÁTÉ, the floor is yours, please deliver your lecture.
So hello everybody, thank you very much for inviting me. So hearing that I have a so controversial image among my colleagues, I have to really claim that I was invited despite the fact that I am thought of as somebody who's raising controversies. In my talk today I will try to do the same, so I will try to foster a little bit of debate about the successfulness of memory politics, or so-called memory politics. So, wait a minute, please. Okay, so I was asked by Gábor to give a talk about the role of Holocaust memory in European accession. So I decided to talk about more broadly, not only about Hungary, but more broadly about this immense enterprise of memory politics, during which the European Union attempted to construct a European identity for its citizens. So I hope that it will be useful both for you and for the panel discussion later. So since the second half of the 1990s, the memory of the Holocaust has played a crucial role in the European Union's integration policy. Based on the recognition that European citizens cannot fall in love with the market, as famously observed in 1989 by former Commission President Jacques Delors, European policymakers have started to increasingly invest in initiatives that have the power to develop the feeling of common belonging. The memory of the Holocaust was meant to express the common European values and provide a common supranational framework of belonging in which every national or local community with different cultural and political backgrounds can find their proper place. Thus, a specific memories construction of the Jewish genocide has become the object of an immense political enterprise. During these 3 decades, we could observe one of the largest experiments in memory politics. Yet, what is precisely memory politics? The political significance of memory is nothing new. Ever since in human history, those who ruled attempted to legitimize their domination with a corresponding representation of the past. Memory politics is something rather different. It is a specific and recent form of politics that aims to intervene into the relations societies maintained in the past. Underlying this form of politics is the belief that memory equals identity. That is, by providing the possibility of identification, the memory narrative contributes to social cohesion. This equation has become taken for granted in scholarly research since at least the rediscovery of Maurice Halbach's theory of collective memory at the turn of the 1980s. Consequently, another definitive scholarly tradition, going back at least to Georg Zimmer, that deals with the inherent relationship between memory and conflict. This tradition had to be marginalized. The social and political conditions of this process are yet to be uncovered. Another underlying belief of memory politics is that the correct or even the healthy relation with the past is a precondition for democratic political rule. In other words, democratization is dependent on the proper way of social remembering. Without political intervention in society, in order to nurture collective memory, so goes the argument, there is no democracy. According to different national contexts, a number of terms have come into general use for this specific sort of intervention, dealing with the past, coming to terms with the past, working through the past, mastering the past, etc. Accordingly, the EU's memory policy initiatives address societies of the member states and aim not only to promote their own economic memory narrative, but also to foster members and institutions of society to make the necessary memory work. Though I will in the following focus on EU integration policy, it is not the only political discourse in history that embraces the idea of collective memory. See, for example, the global institutionalization of the transitional justice paradigm or that of the human rights memory agenda. The reference to the Holocaust is not even the first manifestation of memory policies in the European Union. The memory term of the EU's integration policy dates back to the 1970s, when the notion of cultural heritage became central to the core European values instead of peace, prosperity, and stability. It was only during the geopolitical rearrangement following the end of the Cold War that European institutions embraced a specific form of Holocaust memory endowed with universal moral significance. From a political point of view, the memory construction of the Holocaust that I so far only referred to obscurely as specific is a historically new form of cosmopolitanism. The scholarly literature turned this new form of representation of the past cosmopolitan memory, which is in fact the memory of the Holocaust. It is a collective memory that not only transcends the geographic location of the Jewish genocide, but also meaningful to societies which are not implicated in the alleged after effects of this historical event. The idea that because of the universal significance of the Holocaust, its memory concerns everybody, this is the core of its cosmopolitan nature. This cosmopolitan memory of the Holocaust, which is thus based on the idea of not only historical but also moral uniqueness, came into being in the United States, in a continent which was untouched by the Nazi racist aggression during the war. American society was differently implicated than those in the two Germanys at the time, the societies which had been occupied by the Third Reich or the former Axis countries. The specificities of this social implication, especially its indirect nature in the United States, were among the conditions of possibility of the constitution of a clear-cut and coherent moral memory lesson. This lesson about good and evil is abstracted from the complex historical reality of the Second World War and the Jewish genocide. The moral significance of the cosmopolitan memory of the Holocaust manifested in the imperative of never again, that is, in the moral obligation to prevent the reoccurrence in any form of this radical evil. Institutions of Holocaust memory in the United States of America had their explicit mission of fighting against anti-Semitism. This memory political aspect, that is, the moral obligation to convey a historical lesson in order to achieve a political goal, was historically unprecedented and was thus far from self-evident. As Charles Meyer, historian, put it with regards to the opening of the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. in 1993, I quote, "The lesson cannot be just that genocide is evil. This conclusion hardly requires the museum effort." End quote. Yet scholarly criticism pointing out that history in fact does not repeat itself was unnoticed in a year when Schindler's List featured in the movie theaters. Disseminated by scholarship and the cultural industry, this decontextualized memory of the Holocaust not only transcended national borders, but promised to convey a universal moral lesson that makes every people on earth capable of recognizing injustice as a repetition of radical evil. It was in reaction to losing the Cold War enemy and the concomitant reorganization of the continent's geopolitical landscape that the European Union's integration policy began to systematically refer to the cosmopolitan memory of the Holocaust as a European historical experience with universal significance. The EU presidency statement on 31st October 2005 affirmed, I quote, "The significance of the Holocaust is universal, but it commands a place of special significance in European remembrance. It is in Europe that the Holocaust took place." End quote. The Holocaust has become a reference point as the negative core event of the 20th century or as the inaugural event of the European political identity. It is now the historical lesson of the memory of the Holocaust that is supposed to provide solidarity and a sense of belonging to European citizens. The European political project finds its condition of legitimacy in references to this negative finding needs. All this spurs European institutions to foster the cultivation of cosmopolitan Holocaust memory, both inside European borders and through the enlargement process in the countries waiting for accession. Thus began an immense institutional implementation of memory politics, both on the European and on the national level. Nearly 3 decades have passed since then. Following the recent crisis of European political integration, such as the rise of the right-wing populism, the so-called migration crisis, or more recently the Brexit, there is a growing number of scholars who attempt to assess how efficient or successful memory political initiatives were. In what way they contributed, if at all, to a peaceful and solidary society. Their point of departure is a sharply visible contradiction between the political investment in institutions of memory politics on the one hand, and the lack of social cohesion and political integration on the other. As Valentina Pisanti puts it at the very beginning of a recent book, which is titled "The Guardians of Memory and the Return of the Xenophobic Right," I quote, "Two facts are there for all to see. First, in the last 20 years, the Shoah has been the object of widespread commemorative activities throughout the Western world. Two, in the last 20 years, racism and intolerance have increased dramatically in those very countries where the politics of memory have been implemented with the greatest vigor." End quote. The question is then, continues Pisanti, whether these two facts are unrelated or there is a connection between them, and it is up to a society wishing to oppose the current wave of xenophobia to investigate the reasons for their contradiction. Now, this last statement is of particular importance. For many years, criticism of memory politics could easily be pushed aside by the belief that the problem arises not from the memory articulation of political problems, but from the unequal distribution of memory, which stems either as a result of the insufficient transmission of historical lessons or as a consequence of the unequal relation between different groups' memories. The task was thus, we heard, to make more memory, so that the moral lessons of history be properly conveyed and the marginalized memories equally recognized. If this reasoning reminds us to the neoliberal argument that the solutions to the deficiencies stemming from the market mechanisms, implementation is more marketization that is not by accident. An underlying conviction of memory politics is that the transmission of historical knowledge will change the relation between members of society. Learning the lesson transmitted by memory will make them more capable to relate to each other in a proper way. In the recent book, Beyond Memory, Can We Really Learn from the Past?, Sarah Gainsbourg and Sandrine Lefranc aim precisely to provide an empirically based answer to this question. Why, I quote, the development of memory policy has not been associated with the development of a more tolerant and peaceful society, end quote. Why did passing the moral lesson of the Holocaust memory not lead to the suppression of xenophobia, anti-Semitism, racism? On the one hand, the authors question the tacit presumption that knowledge conveyed by the past leads to a change in attitudes in the individual. They empirically prove that the knowledge about the Holocaust passed on in museums, exhibitions, through a variety of memory contents does not necessarily lead to a change in the attitudes of far-right students. On the contrary, exposure to the lessons of the past leads to a reinforcement of their beliefs that they already had before. On the other hand, Gainsbourg and Lefranc question the presupposition that moral lessons mediated by memory actually change the behavior of individuals. They see the failure of memory politics in that the model of reconciliation to be achieved through knowledge about the past disregards the social embeddedness of the individual who acts in his or her specific social circumstances, even when confronted with the moral lessons of the past. We can conclude from their study that memory policies is the point when addressing the individual mind instead of social relations. As Lea David provides in a recent book, The Past Can't Heal Us, The Dangers of Mandating Memory in the Name of Human Rights, memory political tools aiming to foster the transition from dictatorship to democracy are not only ineffective, but can themselves be the source of social conflict on the ground. Instead of healing so-called societies with a difficult past by implementing standardized tools of moral remembering, they can strengthen categories of nation and ethnicity, increase social inequalities by inducing moral hierarchies of victimhood, and they do not make necessarily people more appreciative to human rights values. According to David, one reason behind these side effects of dealing with the past is what she calls standardization of memory. I quote, "As the human rights memorialization agenda is shaped through the prism of universalism, standardization of memory requires a shift from concrete memories to abstract remembrance. However, this always occurs at the expense of complexities and moral ambiguities. Thus, the dealing with the past approach, which has become deeply rooted in human rights memorialization practices and norms, whitewashes and misinterprets the historical and political context in which it emerged, as if this latter had been apolitical and natural and the only proper way to remember," end quote. On a collective level, the first influential theoretic critique of the memory of the Holocaust, the politics of the memory of the Holocaust, came into being in the mid-1910s as a reaction to the failure with regards to the challenge of the right-wing extremism. In their article entitled On Agonistic Memory, Anna Csentoul and Hans Hansen observed that, I quote, "A cosmopolitan mode of remembering, far from having superseded the antagonistic mode associated with first modernity in the European context, has proved unable to prevent the rise of, and is being increasingly challenged by, new antagonistic collective memories constructed by populist neo-nationalist movements," end quote. For Bull and Hansen, the main reason for this failure is that the cosmopolitan memory construction, that is, the public memory of the Holocaust, is detached from the historical context and, as a consequence, appears as depoliticized, as a technical toolkit of building a good society. They argue that the exclusive role attributed to the non-acting victim similarly precludes the possibility of remembering and understanding the historical context, and also the imperative of identification with abstract ideas of good against evil. All these features of the European integration policy, equal to a complete self-disarmament against the neo-nationalist and Eurosceptical currents that, for their own part, freely reappropriate the political significance of public remembering. In order to counter this challenge, Bull and Hansen introduced a new model of remembering that they term agonistic memory. In contrast to the cosmopolitan model of Holocaust remembrance, agonistic memory does not operate with the abstract moral examples of good and evil, that is, it does not seek to draw universal lessons, but recontextualizes memory. Moreover, this political declaration of reconciliation allows only the position of the victim of historical suffering. In this view of the past, potential moral judgment can only differentiate between criminalized totalitarian regimes of whatever ideology, on the one hand, and the conglomerate of suffering innocent individual victims, on the other. As the document clearly puts it, I quote, "From the perspective of the victims, it is immaterial which regime deprived them of their liberty, or tortured or murdered them for whatever reason." End quote. This is what I call depoliticization. With a deliberate sarcastic exaggeration, one can summarize this whole process as in contemporary European memory culture, the Second World War appears as a mythic struggle between liberal democracy and totalitarianism, fought by an alliance of victims of a Western Holocaust and an Eastern communism. This is indeed a genuine historical moral lesson, but has unfortunately nothing to do with historical reality. If my diagnosis is correct, that the current crisis described above has much more to do with politics than to memory, then the first task is to account for this radical transformation of politics. When did it happen, and why? What are its characteristics? Beyond doubt, the historical shift to memory politics, took place in the free world of the Cold War, somewhere in the late 1970s and the early 1980s. This is when and where the so-called memory boom took place. The usual explanation for this is restricted to temporality. Behind the rise of memory in society since the 1970s lies the uncertainty of expectations for the future, which is also responsible for the crisis in politics. Yet this argument does not give an explanation to the emergence of a new and specific form of politics that addresses the social relation to the past. One possible answer relies on the global power relations characteristic in the given historical period. From this point of view, the birth of memory politics equals to the turning away from transformative politics, which is characterized by the future-oriented and collective reference points. Memory politics was a reaction to the global challenges posited by decolonization on the one hand and by the Cold War struggle on the other. Let me begin with the role of decolonization. The retreat of politics into morality in the Cold War West is illustrated very well by the change in the discourse of human rights in the 1970s. The popular explanation is that the turn away from left-wing political programs was due to the disappointment of 1968 and the colonial liberation struggles both in the East and the West. According to this view, the overwhelming political rise and the importance of human rights is due to the disillusionment with the Cold War realpolitik, which would explain the retreat into the pure world of morality and anti-politics. According to Samuel Moyn, one of the most influential proponents of this new historiography of human rights, this discourse in the 1970s offered the possibility of a last utopia in the midst of a general disillusionment with revolutionary transformation, in which it was possible to take steps towards a better future, even individually as citizens, through small-scale changes. The new historiography, while emphasizing discontinuities and pointing to the untenability of the triumphalist narrative of the gradual spread of human rights, remains limited in its focus on North America and Western Europe. As Joseph Slaughter shows, looking at other parts of the world, in particular the so-called World War, the Third World, we get a rather different narrative. What we see is the use of human rights language as a weapon by advocates of collective national liberation struggles. What happened in the 1970s, continues Slaughter, is therefore not a rediscovery of human rights, but a neoliberal reinterpretation of them in reaction to the anti-colonialist efforts that focused on the responsibility of the capitalist West. It is not the extension of rights, but the deprivation of rights, which can be interpreted as a re-subjugation of the global South, seeking to free itself from colonial dependence. Now, let me turn to the role of Cold War power relations and their role that they played in the narcissistic turns in politics. In the aftermath of the Second World War, Cold War power relations played a key role in defining the discursive conditions for references to the moral significance of the World War. From the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950 onwards, the international position of the Federal Republic of Germany was increasingly determined by its role as part of the Western Alliance. This country's importance was more about averting the communist threat than the importance of cleaning the society of Nazis and Nazism. The position of the newly created German Democratic Republic was also influenced by the Soviet bloc's Cold War aims. This German question became the central issue of the early Cold War Europe, with the moral significance of the Nazi past subordinated to geopolitical rivalries. In other words, power relations between the blocs also influenced the development of the war narrative. In the crossfire of Eastern Bloc communist campaigns against the continuity between Hitler's Reich and Adenauer's Republic and the alleged re-nazification of West Germany, which was present, West Germany presented the issue of fascism as a matter of the past. While the communists urged political trials of former Nazis in West Germany, Adenauer's regime attempted to prove its democratic nature by taking moral responsibility and reparations payments. Put simply, the Cold War West pursued a moralizing strategy, while the East pursued a criminalizing strategy characterized by antagonistic temporality. The former sought to define the significance of the issue of fascism as memory, the latter as actuality. This was an important historical period in which the moral significance of the Second World War and the Jewish genocide by Nazis has become a problem of moral significance and a problem of memory. Let me summarize what I attempted to say today. This profound change of politics in the Western world, especially in the North American continent, can be characterized by an orientation towards the past. This is the importance of memory. A retreat from politics to morality. The use of the sacred idea of the Holocaust as a moral yardstick. The language of human rights and the anti-communist neoliberal ideology. This change to an anti-political sense of politics is responsible for the fact that the revolutionary or at least transformative conception of democracy has been replaced by a technical transition concept of democracy, which only requires the application of pre-given standardized toolkit of moral remembering. So what conclusion can we draw from all this? My personal scholarly answer is the reconstruction of the anti-fascist consensus that, as historian Dan Stone proves, reigned in post-war societies on both Eastern and Western Europe. While anti-fascism in Western Europe did not transform into state ideology, as in Eastern Europe, it structured and shaped what post-war societies in the West were to become. The lessons of fascism led Christian conservative elites to embrace class cooperation, the welfare state, parliamentary democracy. This moral order based on the common experience of defeating fascism. This was not memory politics, but a source of legitimacy for the political relevance of memory. I believe that its historical and sociological reconstruction might help critically observe our present and establish possible ways out from our deep political crisis. Thank you very much for your attention.
The Holocaust memory and the memory policy within the European Union, and I would like to highlight a few thoughts before giving the word to Katrina first and then to Agnes. What I would emphasize is that MÁTÉ talked about a turn to memory in the 1970s. So it's a crucial point that in the last 3 decades, European policies also very strongly pushed to put memory in front, and with the regime change, it brought a different situation because new countries with different memories and different 40 years of processing the 20th century arrived to this European Union. And it also caused a conflict of speaking about the past or positioning ourselves, rather, because for the European Union, the Western part, the Holocaust, was found as a core point for historical memory, and then Eastern Europe joined this victim narrative. It was a victim narrative, and East Europe joined with a different victim narrative to show that we are also victims, and we also need appreciation and also founding, we can say, on the European level. And this story was communism and anti-communism. And also a very important point that it is questionable whether this moral policy really brought the results that the initiators had in mind with it, and also can be questioned in a moral way as well, opening up new conflicts and new points of inclusion and exclusion. And now, for something more completely different, I would say, Katerina, please tell your story, because now it's talk and lecture. It's not lecture, it's talk and discussion from now on. So much that, as far as I can, you don't have a lecture title or so. So please share your thoughts.
I mean, it's working. Well, I don't even know where to start, because of course I was extremely, inspired by MÁTÉ. And I'm so happy, I'm so curious actually to hear about your views. I always think it's more interesting to ask the questions actually than to answer them as a professional disease. But I was joking here with Monty in the coffee break. I was saying that, okay, so if I just, sum up what you said, then basically you're telling me that a lot of my, working hours are absolutely useless because I'm doing the wrong thing. So let me be the one, spurring the little bit of the, disagreement. We're not so being a diplomat is not always being diplomatic in a vague way, especially not a Swedish diplomat, because we are. If you check on the world value scale, this study, you can see that we're kind of extremist in a way. But that's another very interesting other discussion. But I'm not a scholar. Okay, so I'm not going to go into some kind of academic debate where I'm on too deep water, but I just wanted to share with you how we are working, for example, here in Budapest, and I would love to contrast that kind of hands-on, micro-level operization of memory politics in the Swedish embassy with your thesis, because it's wonderful, because then I really ask myself, so how are we doing the right thing? I think that's an extremely interesting question. So let's start. I mentioned the icon that is, very present in my life, which is, of course, my former colleague of Wallenberg. And you know about him. Perhaps I should start asking that. He's a legend. He saved. Literally, this. Quarters where we are sitting here, Wallenberg saved 10,000 of Jews during the second half of 44, in the midst of the most dark chapters of Hungarian history at that time. And then the question is like, okay, how do you honor a legacy of that person? That's what I like to talk about. And of course, and I think there's several aspects. We do it a lot. So I'll say that Wallenberg is not some kind of historic, abstract figures for us, in the black and white, pages of the history book and so on. He's very, very much alive, because what he did was absolutely outstanding. But on the other hand, there was a lot of myths around him. If you ask the question, for example, what is a hero? This famous the Germans will know the Brecht, das Land das Helden braucht. That's a little bit of a different one, but of course you can ask, why is it important? But of course, it was an outstanding deed. And then how do you honor that legacy in the way? You can, of course, commemorate, his birthday and the day when he disappeared, and so weiter and so weiter. But of course, for us, the major task is somehow to translate these deeds. And now I think we're kind of, coming here in a kind of interesting, potentially, I would say conflict point, but we're doing exactly this, right? We're just trying to ask ourselves, okay, what is relevant of his deeds for you today? And I spend a lot of hours in my work talking to people like yourself, but mostly here in Hungary, obviously, about, what does it mean today? Simply put, what would Wallenberg have said today about what's going on in Hungary? What would his comments have been, trying to translate that kind of civil courage, that kind of bravery into today? I was talking about myths. I think it's extremely interesting, the kind of sometimes very romanticized images of these heroes. I mean, we tend to, see them as these, lonely wolves coming in and saving thousands of lives. I mean, Vladimir definitely intervened in that very practical way, literally, preventing people from being shot at the Danube. But of course, that's not the entire story. The story is that he was a fantastic organizer. He was a leader. He was a coordinator. He had a team. And that's something else which comes up in our work when we talk about this kind of, actions of that, not being a bystander is not just a solo performance. It's being together. I mean, Vladimir had a team of 350 people here in Budapest, and that were Jewish, and by that he protected them, of course, but he could not have done what he did. It was a logistical operation. He was providing, food for 10,000 of people. He was providing housing. He was providing medical services and so on. So that's, that's a kind of different aspect of this, how we view our. But then, going back to the core, and this is what I'm talking with the school children about today, to say that, okay, no other parallels. I'm not saying that we all should, aspire. Most of us are not going to become humanitarian icons. But I do still firmly always return to these, you may have heard the very famous words of Professor Julia Bauer, who was saying that, never be a victim, never be a perpetrator, but never be a bystander. And somehow, this is of course now what I want to throw back perhaps the ball to MÁTÉ, saying that yes, and I can ask myself, so in this kind of work, have I converted the far right students? Probably not. I think that's a presumption. But then I'm still a firm believer in that this kind of work, this kind of, basically it's human rights training, right? This is about talking about tolerance and civil courage and empowering people, that, it does boost resilience. I think this is a way to strengthen our immunity, let's talk about that in these pandemic times. When it comes to the most lethal virus, perhaps not the coronavirus, but the virus of intolerance and xenophobia and so on. I do believe, because most of us would probably belong to that big group of bystanders. We may not be the worst perpetrators, most of us hopefully, but some of us are definitely victims. So, of course, I do believe that there is meaning in my work when we talk about this, and meeting the students, sitting and asking them, trying to visualize this historic figure, dragging him out of the history books, not as some just abstract guy who did a lot of, heroic deeds, but actually, trying to translate that into today and say, okay, this is what we're doing. For example, we had, I'll just give you some very hands example. We do a lot of projects, right? Exactly in this region of human rights training. We had an award this year in Hungary, which is called the Young Courage Award, where we basically awarded very young people who showed civil courage. And I was overwhelmed by the response. And of course these are, this is microdata, and I won't be able to, show in some regression analysis that we have now influenced, Hungarian youth to become more tolerant. But I know for sure that, for example, having that call out there, to go out there and acknowledge and visualize and see these people who came with their fascinating stories of how they had countered hate speech and how they had, talked about LGBTQ rights and gender equality, things which are, how should we put it diplomatically, not uncontroversial in today's Hungary. I definitely see that as a very important part of my work. I think I will stop here.
Yes, so I will connect to also several things that you mentioned too. So because, okay, this was not MÁTÉ's experiment, but I have a criticism towards this experiment, when they experiment with, okay, were there is radical right-wingers convinced or not? They are never the target group, like they are a small minority, and it's not important, to be honest, no, it's a waste of energy. The aim is to have the neutral or ignorant, so the majority who is probably not a radical right winger in any class that you choose randomly. So as I like to put it, the aim is to have to put question marks in their heads instead of exclamation marks. Those who already have the exclamation marks, they are not my target group. So when I used to be engaged in Holocaust education too, And I haven't encountered these cases actually, but in our training we were told several times that it doesn't matter if someone was raised up in a very prejudiced environment and in an authoritarian family, you cannot change that in 45 minutes. But in 45 minutes you can make 20 other kids interested in the topic, and that's the important thing. So I think this experiment didn't make sense with the already anti-Semitic people. And then I will add several points, just to think further, because on the whole I very much agreed with MÁTÉ's conclusion. But let's think about to what extent it is good to base a community on a trauma. So that's also a problem with putting the Holocaust in the center of a common identity, that it's a trauma. And actually, one of my favorite historians, an Israeli one, Elkana, but he came from Hungary, by the way, so he survived the show in I think in Transylvania, but so Hungary at the time. So he then became a historian in Israel, and he wrote an article entitled "The Need to Forget" in the 90s during the Intifada. So his argument was that since the 70s, 80s, in Israel, the memory of the Holocaust was abused to the extent that Israeli society needs to forget, that they just talk too much about it and in the wrong way. And I like this article because it was very provocative, and I was at your age, so it was in the very beginning of my master, and it was very shocking, that I was taught for many years to never forget and remember and so on, and I want to be a historian, and then there is this historian who tells you that, you know what, you need to forget, or that's something that you should learn. But he didn't mean that that people should not know about the Holocaust. He meant that the Israeli identity should not be based on this fact that there was a genocide against the Jews. Because a lot of Israeli politicians use this fact in order to legitimize their repression against Palestinians, and that this connection was something, it went into very bad directions. And then another point I would like to raise is that the genocide of the European Jews, it's a common trauma, and it happened in almost all in the whole continent. But at the same time, there was a genocide against the Sinti and Roma, and it's also a common European event. It also happened in almost all these countries, and it's not remembered in the same way. It's not put at the center. And yet another thing to think about, that usually when they say never forget and never again, and let's then you would think that it means that it should never ever again happen, and we will not let it happen. But just very shortly after the change of the regime, which MÁTÉ talked about, Srebrenica happened. So, but then again, the question is, of course, okay, what should you have done? But as a matter of fact, in Europe, again, mass murders were happening just after this happy reunification of the continent, when the Berlin Wall fell. And I will also talk about a myth, so there is this notion that, the communists did not allow people to remember the past, and especially not the Holocaust, whereas in the free, happy Western Europe they could. And here I would like to connect to MÁTÉ that there was a common anti-fascist narrative, or there was a common framework that did go beyond the Iron Curtain. So this is the myth of silence, that in communist societies nobody knew anything. And yes, it was oppressed, but as a matter of fact, when we look at the end of the Holocaust and the Second World War, Hungarian Jews pioneered the publication of memoirs, and by the hundreds they published books about what has happened. And also in the morning we talked about the publications of these teenagers' diaries like Ellen Baer and Anne Frank and and so on, and except for Anne Frank's diary, all those other diaries that we talked about were published much later, whereas Eva Heymann's diary was published right after the Holocaust. And so there is a Hungarian historian, Ferenc Laczó, who writes a lot about this myth of silence. And then other thing, so it was manipulated for sure. There was no freedom of the press. But Anne Frank's story was several times on the stage in Hungary in the 50s. So it's not as simple as that. And there are a lot of other examples, but maybe I will not go into them. Maybe a last thing is that that discourses about the past and remembering these events, it's very easy to misuse, unfortunately. So, for instance, in 2015 there was a discourse in Hungary which argued against the distribution of refugees and that every member state should accept refugees. So there was this argument that, well, Hungary already had its fair share. We accepted so many Polish refugees in the Second World War, which is true by the way, but well, we did this, so who are the Germans now and who is Merkel to tell us, what we should do with refugees? What were they doing when, when the Polish refugees came here? So it's such an abuse of the past, but it's very easy to make. So I think also it's exactly because Holocaust memory is too depoliticized and too much taken out of context, and that's why for the opponents of it, it's very easy to abuse these stories.
Okay, MÁTÉ, would you like to react to what we have heard?
Yes, thank you. So I did not mean that your work is not important. Let me precise my position in this. I'm not against memory work. I'm not against commemorations. I think that commemorating the legacy of Wallenberg is a very important thing. I'm not even against moral lessons. I think many moral lessons can be drawn from the life and work and heroic work of Wallenberg. My problem is the political use of memory. That is my problem. My problem is when the only precondition of democracy is a proper way of remembering. I think this is a problem, because I believe that democracy is about people's representation. It is a people's sovereignty. It is a political representation. So my problem is when the institutions of political representation are replaced with a discourse of representing victims of the past in a political discourse. So I did not touch this problem in my talk, but let me just point to it very briefly, that this is another aspect of this degradation of politics into memory. This dissolution of democratic mass institutions in Western countries and later in Western countries following the regime changes. This so-called neo-conservative revolution with Thatcher and Reagan and others who, it was said that it is too expensive, we cannot afford this, there is a decline in economies, etc., etc. But the end, whatever the reasons were, the end result was that mass institutions of vertical representation of group interests, be them mass parties or trade unions, were this unfolded, how to say it, dissolved. Their importance was very much decreased. So, and as a result, there is a situation in which, a political situation in which, without these core intermediaire, as the French says, this intermediary corps, political corps, which transmits the elite, between the elite and the people, without these core intermediaire, there is the whole people, all the people, and there is the elite. And the elite tries to embrace all the people. So this is something radically new. This is what populism is in the first sense. So that is my problem. I am against delegating political problems and actions to memory. That is my problem is that the European Union, and not just the European Union, there are a bunch of literature of the global institutionalization of memory politics. How, human rights NGOs and post-conflict solutions went on the rock because of this deficit of politics. When you impose a right way of remembering, irrespective of the local context of the conflicts. And apropos the Srebrenica, there are many researches which especially looked into the role of NGOs and post-conflict solutions in Serbia, post-Yugoslavia. And this kind of disrespect of local conceptualizations of the conflict. This imposition from above, this decontextualized schematic memory construction of Holocaust, inevitably it went on the rock. So it produced new inequalities. I give you one example. In this discourse, the archetype of suffering is the Jewish genocide. So what was the consequence of the on the Yugoslavian ground of this? The victims of Srebrenica were representing themselves, and they were referring to themselves as the true victims, the real victims. We are the real victims, and because of that, other political victims were morally degraded. This hierarchy of victimhood, this is a very, bad, I'm bad consequence. I'm against this. I believe that we cannot morally differentiate between victims. So I hope that it is more clear that my problem is not with memory work. And actually, I have a research project on Jan Levai, who wrote a book on Wallenberg, and was one of the first researchers of Wallenberg's deeds. So I'm very much for it. Just wanted to precise my position. Thank you.
So before giving you the chance to contribute or ask, as the moderator, I think to my role it's also a part of it that I also put questions or a new approach, a new aspect to this talk. So in the story of remembrance and memory, there are politicians and the academic sphere, historians, whatever, and then they are in a different boat, I would say. So once we were sitting in Jena on a talk, and Brian Horowitz, an American historian, told that, okay, we historians, we are myth busters, we kill myth. So that's a profession. We see a myth and then we shoot. So it's not true, or something like that. Politicians, their work is integration or something like that. So they work with myth, they need them. So if there aren't, they have to make or forge something. They used to integrate on national level, and now with the European Union there's a different problem, how to do it on an international multinational level. So conflicting national narratives, how to make them, and that is a kind of dilemma, I guess, for a European decision maker. So what to do, and when you say not traumas, or why don't we find something else? Yeah, national myths are based on something national pride, or we won, but of course they won over somewhere else. The Hungarian myth is the 1,000-year-old empire, and then there are at least 3 nations in Europe that could, so on the 20th century, their national identity is based on the negation of this empire. So, therefore, Holocaust seems to be a kind of, to avoid this kind of finding something universal or how you told in your lecture, cosmopolitan against it or besides it. So I give the chance for one more round, and then I would like to ask you to contribute to the talk.
Yes, thank you. Well, I'm not completely sure about this strict distinction between politics and science or scholarly work. If you look at how this memory political discourse was built up, it was a very important reference to scholarly work. It was scholars who developed this idea of memory, which leads to identity. And I should say that politicians, leaders of European institutions and governments were very, honest and reliable, that they did not end up to figure out something completely new. They referred to scholarly research. So these were the ideas of Miriam Noha and Jan Assmann and Aleida Assmann. There were institutions of scholarly work, and these politics referred to this. These politics used this scholarly knowledge.
Yeah. I don't know where to. I just wanted to react because I really want to hear about you. We already started in the coffee break, but this thing that you just mentioned, Agnes, was triggered. It was a bit of a different, but the whole, you said the myth about that we didn't discuss it, and which leads into this whole, and now the Germans will understand. I mean, the whole Vergangenheitsbewältigung issue, right? And which is really something I'm going to throw out to all your countries. We started talking a bit about Poland and so on, and how we relate to the past, and I can't help reflecting on what Agnes was saying with this interesting and provocative Israeli historian then saying that, okay, no, this cannot define our identity. We have to expand that. It can't just be this atrocities is trauma. And the challenge of saying that, and what this leads to when it comes to the national myths and how we should. And now I'm diving into this very kind of operational issue again of how we. Because the only thing I can say as a non-scholar is that I still do believe we need to talk about the past. And this was very, very simplistic, no? I mean, and I will still question, but please prove me wrong, because I know that there is a big debate in Hungary about exactly the lack of this, and even if it seems that it's a bit more nuanced perhaps than the simplistic non-scholarly way to look at it, but let's say that I would still say that it's definitely a challenge today. I mean, what's being now discussed in the schools or in the textbooks, or and so forth. And then I'm also thinking about my own home, country in that sense, in Sweden, this, spared island. I mean, some people, there's a Hungarian Jewish author who was a 56 refugee, came to Sweden. He said that the problem in Sweden is that we are peace damaged. Okay, so 200 years of peace, and not being involved in some of these major conflicts, and I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm not being romantic about not having to carry the kind of heritage that basically all of you in here, including myself. But it's also interesting because now, I mean, even in Sweden, and this is where I'm getting about, turning all the stones, we have had now finally, which I think was also long overdue, a debate about, for example, our actions during the Second World War, which then, turns out that there are things we can discuss also, right? So it's of course not that simple, and you probably know about that we were just neutral and that was it, right? That's not the full story. And still, my reaction to that is that it's very healthy. But this is, we still need to talk about these things, but this is where I want to throw out the ball to you in your respective countries. I mean, we already started talking about, your visit to Auschwitz in Poland, and I mean, from the German side, oh my God, there will be a lot of questions, and I'd like to hear from you. I mean, how much discussion did you have in your schools, now at your workplaces? I mean, how much is that past present in your lives today? I know this is very, very wide, and perhaps I'm getting a bit off right here, but I really want to kind of hear the inputs in a bit more hands-on way.
I'm happy to pass on, the word to to the group.
Okay, maybe I can thank you all for your introductions and for your thoughts and ideas. I really enjoyed listening to you all. First of all, like maybe to your question, and then I will continue with Mr. ZOMBORY. So, for example, Srebrenica was not a topic at my school. I've studied European. Okay, thank you. I started studying European studies with emphasis on social science of the EU, and all above it are the general public that we call the European identity. So how is there a way of returning back of this cosmopolitan cultural memory, which I assume is really hard because it's like there is a spillover effect of European integration, there is no coming back, and it goes on and on. So what could be the solution of diverting or changing the way that countries, each individual country, look at their cultural memory or their trauma from the perspective, from local, regional perspective? So how can institutions get back from this integration mindset back to the local mindset? Thank you.
Okay, perhaps we could collect some other remarks or questions.
Next, so I also would like to thank you all for your remarks. And referring to your question first, maybe, I feel like pretty much the same as it was before. That there are no institutional way of remembering any historical events like Holocaust, for example. I mean, I attended a high school at the city where one of the most of the biggest concentration camps in Poland were located, but it wasn't even mandatory for every class to attend this camp and see how it worked, how it functioned. So that's why, and it's not just the case of myself. I think it's the case of whole school system in Poland. So I think that the biggest problem is it's not that we argue about Holocaust or about memory. We do not do that because we don't know we don't have sufficient knowledge to argue. So that's the biggest problem, I think, at the moment. And when it comes to questions, I'm wondering if we would like to go back and stop politicizing the memory. If it would have to be global solution done in the global scale, or if it could be done only on the European scale, because I'm afraid, maybe I'm wrong, but based on my Polish experience, for example, I'm afraid that if we do this, stop politicizing the memory only on European scale, we may fall victim to other countries, for example, like Russia, who also strongly politicize the memory. So if we don't have our own, let's say, version of memory, we may fall victim to the, for example, Russian one or Chinese or whatever. So I think that's the problem, or maybe it's not. Thank you very much.
Hey, I'm thankful as well for you to be here, and my question is about whether anybody or any of you think that populism is a legitimate answer to Western arrogance after this democratic transition. Just to explain it, here is the Cold War, and the eastern side loses, and then here comes the West, who pats the East on the shoulder and says, okay, you guys lost, now I'm the winner, now follow exactly every step I do, or not, you're gonna get the same treatment as Serbia. Get NATO bombed because you were determined to be on the wrong side of history, and NATO stood behind Croatia, and completely ignoring the fact that both Croatia and Serbia did horrible war crimes at the same time, just picked a side. And here is Europe, where the Western side says that you have to follow our political structure, our cultural values, be politically correct, and here's a certain populist people or group in the East who decides that no, we don't want to do that because you beat us, why would you want to force your view on us? And it's a sort of cultural resistance, like many of those were in the past, and it formulates in the sort of like right-wing populism without any meaning or any material value in it, just for the sake of resistance. Like Putin, in my opinion, is an answer for Boris Yeltsin, a laughing stock of the West. And here comes Putin, a strong man, who is exactly the response that probably the Russian populace or the politically active group wanted.
Hi, so I would do just a quick rephrasal. In my school, I'm also from Poland. It was obligatory to visit 2 concentration camp museums, and I'm from Western Poland, so that's strange. And to put a further emphasis on what my predecessor said, I think that's the main difference between Western understanding of the political and cultural memory, rather than in comparison to the Eastern one. For example, there was a really huge right-wing movement, radical right-wing movement in Denmark some years ago, which was really destroyed by only the fact that the ruling party or the ruling coalition took the main part of, let's say, enforcing more strict laws on immigration. And then the whole movement collapsed. Right, the whole right-wing movement. And in Eastern Europe, it's much more complicated than that. It's not that the right-wing parties are gaining support only because of like one catchphrase, like we don't like immigrants, we do something, we like our culture, we like our values. It's much deeper, and I think that it eludes European EU when it comes to mostly Hungary and Poland. As we are in Hungary, I think it's a very big problem that it comes from the cultural memory that it simplifies a lot, and I think it's very dangerous. Also when it comes to Holocaust, right? Like when we've talked before, I had this thing in my head that Holocaust memories in every country are vastly different, and I think that Holocaust can be used as this grip that takes all of the European culture and all of our European values together, because it's vastly different experience for a lot of countries. You can't compare Holocaust in France to Holocaust in Poland, because it's 2 different things and a lot of different events that happened. And that worries me, that the EU as an institution simplifies too much on the very complex problems that it should not. I think I'm the last one.
Okay, then let's come back.
Okay, I know.
Yes, so I think so the populism is not a legitimate answer, but an understandable one to Western arrogance, and I think the situation was even worse after the change of regime, because there was even this kind of colonial logic that we should, and self-colonizing logic as well from part of the elites in Eastern Europe, that finally we were liberated, so we have to be grateful and we have to accept this and that, because finally they liberated us. Although this was not the case, it simply state socialism collapsed and the Soviet Union collapsed. But I think that therefore there was not much resistance for many decades, because the idea was that this is a good thing, that the West finally overtook, as if there would have to be, like one ruler. And maybe that about the Yugoslav war, that it's true that it's even more problematic that so the EU was a bystander to the Srebrenica mass murder, but on the other hand, in the NATO bombing of Serbia, it was very active. I mean, most of these states are members of the NATO and did participate in it. And yes, I pass the word on that. It was, yeah, you had very interesting comments. Thank you, but I want to give time for you too.
I actually want to hear your, but I think that question about the European narrative versus the other, let's say, powers is very, I can't answer that, but it's really for the historians to do. I mean, what you were saying now about the Hungarian, of course, I mean, I'm sitting here as a representative of a country of the European Union. The European Union has Article 2 about fundamental values, and we all signed up to that. So for me, yes, understandable populism as some kind of resistance for the sake of resistance, but of course I have difficulties as a Swedish diplomat to be compared to Soviet invasion and Turkish invasion and Huns and Habsburgs and so on. Of course, for me it's absolutely not just ridiculous in the sense, but it's also deeply offensive for me to hear about Brussels as an equivalent to the former totalitarian repressive apparatus, which was dictating while frankly I'm paying my tax money, right? I mean, to be now somewhat transactional to boost 3-4% of the GDP of Hungary. So I mean, when it comes to these fundamental values, I don't see here some kind of Western hegemony dictating for Eastern losers how to do. I see this as something we sign up to. It's something that we have agreed upon, and of course it's not a secret that we from the side of not just Sweden but also other countries see it as deeply problematic when we see rule of law, democracy, human rights being eroded. And I do think that that's a huge problem, and I think that we all, I mean, we have a big debate about how to counter that with this usual sentence of saying that nobody really anticipated it, because therefore we don't have the instruments. The instruments are coming, though, I want to stress that, and I think it's a serious challenge. When your comments about Vladimir Vladimirovich, well, I have spent 4 years in Moscow. It's not my impression that Vladimir is the answer to all the Russian people's aspirations. I will put it. Stop there, I think. Yeah.
Thank you very much for these remarks and questions. So I try to answer them, or at least react to them. First of all, yours. Whether the European Union memory politics can be treated as a elite intervention in the populist sense, I don't think so, because these initiatives, which, for example, is this Europe for Citizens program itself, these initiatives aim to engage citizens. So what they are doing is not that we are the elite, we say what you should say, but somehow they want to make people react. They want people to make their own memory work. Now, the problem is that, in my opinion, this whole imagination that memory leads to cohesion, it is an impasse. So I think this is a problem. I would not say that it is a populist. I think by this memory politics, the European Union reacts to the problem of a populist setting, and I'm not reducing the problem of populism to the right-wing extremism or left-wing extremism, but simply I'm using this word to describe this situation that there is no institutional transmission between the top and the bottom. So this is my answer. And concerning your other question, which is what shall we do? Well, I always get this question, and it is really hard to answer. I don't have a recite, but I think that we need a double direction. First, the whole objective is to liberate memory from the political world. Which means that we should repoliticize democracy in a way that we don't want to solve political problems, for example, political representation, social inequalities, taxation, etc., by way of memory politics. And at the same time, this is not enough. That is what I'm doing, but this is not enough. There needs to be a process of institutionalization, re-institutionalization. I think we should somehow build new institutions of political representation, because this political populist setting that I was describing it will always reproduce these tensions. And yours, yes, of course, you can say that if we change strategy, then our opponents will, get an advantage. If we change politics, then our adversaries will be in a better position. But you can say it to every kind of global problems. For example, to climate change and etc. Somebody has to start. And I believe that if there is a sense of, if you are a voter, you are a citizen, and if you have the sense that your voice is heard in some way institutionally, not necessarily by the very top elite, but by regional or intermediate institutional systems, then you can feel that you are a member of a community. Okay, so I think that if we not only liberate memory from the burden of politics, but at the same time we give the opportunity for institutional representation, then people, they won't see, they won't feel themselves abandoned. And this is, maybe I'm naive, but I think that this is an answer. And I don't know what, you did not ask me, so I don't have to answer your question. And you also had a question, but I think you already answered this question if Vladimir Putin is the answer. So,
No, it was just the archetype of the politician. Not the person itself, but the strong man,
Yes. Okay, so I found the button. I agree with you that somehow the strong man can make the feeling in people that yes, he will solve, he will be the solution. And I think this, neo-populist rise inside the European Union, this is a symptomatic consequence of the political deficit of the European Union. So, yes, it is a promise. Now I will give back the voice to you. But there is a paradox. There is a leader who gives back the people. There is a paradox. Donald Trump is the living paradox. That he is the member of the people, but he is a multi-millionaire. Okay.
I really would like to go back to this intermediate institution. Do you mean, could this intermediate institution look like a regional representation of the people? Actually, there is an institution, it's called the Committee of the Regions. But this Committee of the Regions is just a consultant body of the European Union. So this kind of institutions you mean, right? I mean the regional one.
Not only political ones, I mean,
Thank you.
I think in economics, it's very important. In economics, I would say economic democracy. Democratic control of economic enterprise. Democratic control of corporate, aggression and injustice. So this intermediate institutional system, it is necessary not only in politics, but also in economics.
Thank you.
So my task now is to somehow close this conversation, just temporarily, because we can continue it at a restaurant. To where exactly we shall participate. We raised very interesting thoughts, conflicting and debatable ideas. So let's continue, and I hope it's going to be fruitful in the future, and also in this project.
Thank you.